Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Um, Today, our presenter is, uh, oh, sorry.
Right on the screen, Tim Burnham.
Yeah, yes, Tim Burham. Um, he's the trainer for NB and PEI Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. And today, the topic is private refugee sponsorship. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Jing. And can you see my screen okay? You can see the slide? Okay,
Yes, I can see.
perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. This morning, we're just going to do an overview of the private refugee sponsorship program in Canada. And Jing, can I just ask, we're having interpretation into other groups, is that right?
Yes, our interpreter now is on site. They are present with our clients. So it's okay. You just speak slow and pause for each few sentence. Then
Okay,
they are available to translate your,
okay,
just a
perfect. All
second,
right, thank you.
translate your speech.
Okay, great. So as Jing said, I work for the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. And this program is a free program, and it's designed to support sponsors of private refugees. So this is our agenda today. I'm just going to speak first about what private refugee sponsorship is, and then who can be sponsored as a refugee, who can sponsor from Canada, what the sponsorship costs are, and the settlement responsibilities. And then I should have time for some questions at the end. So just to briefly look at some statistics from the UN about refugees. There are about 35 million refugees, as you see the second number there, who are displaced in other countries right now. And then there are other people who are displaced within their countries, about 62 million, and about 5 million asylum seekers. Normally, only about 5% of refugees will be resettled each year. So a very small number actually end up being resettled. In Canada, we have the private sponsorship of refugees. So the private sponsorship of refugees is the resettlement of a refugee to Canada with the financial costs and the settlement support provided by private groups for 12 months. You've probably heard of government-assisted refugees. These are refugees who are sponsored by the government. But as we'll see, in Canada, citizens and permanent residents are able to engage in the resettlement of refugees as well. And in this program, sponsors can name which refugees they wish to sponsor. And that makes it possible for families to be able to bring friends and relatives from abroad. So in the private sponsorship of refugees, sponsors give financial support to the refugees to cover their expenses for 12 months. And sponsors also provide refugees with settlement support when they arrive in Canada. So settlement support could mean helping a refugee find housing or open a bank account or enroll in school. And we'll look more about at that a little bit later. Okay, so these are the settlement programs as they exist in Canada. I'll just let you see all of them here. There are 3 government programs called government sponsorship, joint sponsorship, and blended sponsorship. And you'll see that in each of these, the refugees are referred to Canada by the UNHCR. That's the organization within the United Nations that help to sponsor refugees. And the finances are provided by the government or by a combination of the government and private citizens. When you look over to the right to this column of private sponsorship, the finances and the settlement are provided completely by citizens and permanent residents, and the refugees are referred to Canada by the citizens and permanent residents. So, who can privately sponsor refugees? Basically, there are 3 groups that can privately sponsor refugees in Canada. So an individual person cannot sponsor refugees, only a group can sponsor. So first, there are sponsorship agreement holders. That's an organization that has an agreement with the Canadian government to sponsor refugees. Then there are groups of 5, and that's just 5 Canadian citizens or permanent residents who come together to sponsor refugees. And then there are community sponsors, which is any organization or corporation that wants to sponsor a refugee. So here's the big difference between the first group, which is sponsorship agreement holders, and the other 2 groups, which are groups of 5 and community sponsors. Sponsorship agreement holders can sponsor a limited number of refugees each year, and the refugee applicants do not need to have refugee status in order to be sponsored by a sponsorship agreement holder. When it comes to groups of 5 and community sponsors, they can sponsor as many refugees as they're able based on their financial and settlement capacity. But with these groups, the refugee applicants must have refugee status. So this is the big difference between sponsorship agreement holders and groups of 5 or community sponsors, whether or not the refugee has a refugee status document. So, who can sponsor from within Canada? As I said, a sponsorship agreement holder is an incorporated organization, and they have a formal sponsorship agreement with IRCC. Community sponsors are any organization or association or corporation, and they're located in the community where the refugee is going to settle. These are the requirements for a group of 5. First of all, the refugee must have a refugee status determination document, and we'll talk about those a bit more in the next slide. And the members of the group, there have to be 5, and they have to be Canadian citizens or permanent residents. They must be 18 years or older. They must have the financial capacity, the settlement capacity, and they have to live in the same community where the refugees are expected to spend their first year. Okay, so for groups of 5 and community sponsors, you can only sponsor someone who is recognized as a refugee by the United Nations or by the government authorities of the country where they live. After a person has been assessed and recognized as a refugee, they receive a document called a refugee status document. And those are the pictures you see there on the left, refugee status documents. Things that are not valid as refugee status documents are a UN asylum seeker document, or UN registration, or a UNWRA document. So there's a specific document. There's a
Sorry,
specific
Tim.
document they must have. Oh, sure.
Sorry, Tim, could I interrupt? We just have in our chat that the interpreter missed something on the last slide. If you could just go back to the last slide.
Yep, they just want to see it.
And maybe, yeah, just give them a second to explain it. They just didn't have time
Sure.
to explain.
Yep.
Thank you. Sorry to
Sure.
interrupt you.
That's fine, and I can't see the chat right now, so that's great if you just chime in if someone has something to say.
Yeah, no
Thank
problem.
you. Okay, so those are the requirements for to be eligible as a member of a group of 5. Okay, so yeah, these what is needed for a group of 5 or community sponsor is a refugee status document. And again, that is not the same as an asylum seeker certificate or UNHCR registration or a UNWRA document. Okay, so a refugee status determination document. This is what's needed for a refugee who's going to be sponsored by a group of 5. So they're mandatory for groups of 5 and community sponsors. And without a refugee status document, a refugee can only be sponsored by a sponsorship agreement holder. And a refugee status document normally has words like recognized refugee on it or international protection. That's kind of how you know that it's a refugee status document. And when you're sponsoring someone from overseas, only the principal applicant needs to have this refugee status document. So only one person in a family needs to have this document. So if you want to sponsor someone who does not have a refugee status document, you can only sponsor them through a sponsorship agreement holder. And the way that you find the sponsorship agreement holder is through the government website, which you see the link for it here, and I can send this link afterwards to people. And you simply put in what province you're in, and a list of sponsorship agreement holders will come up. This is the path that you have to take, again, if the refugee does not have a refugee status document. And again, I'll put this link in the chat at the end, and I can send it out to anyone who needs to find a sponsorship agreement holder. Okay, we'll move on now to ask, who can be sponsored from overseas? So the answer is only a refugee can be sponsored. And there are two types of refugees. So what's called a convention refugee abroad class is a person who has a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, religion, or nationality, or their membership in a social group, or because of a political opinion. The other category of refugees is country of asylum class. These are people who have been seriously or personally affected by war or have suffered massive human rights violations. And again, as with the refugee status document, only the principal applicant, so only one person in the family, needs to fall into these categories of being a refugee. Okay, so if someone is a refugee and they want to be sponsored to come to Canada, these are the further requirements that they need to meet. They have to have left their country of origin and be living in another country. They have to have a sponsoring group in Canada who wants to sponsor them. They have to be unable or unwilling to return to their home country. They have to be unable to stay in the current country where they live. And also, they cannot resettle in another safe country. So in order to be sponsored, at least one member of the family has to be a refugee who has left their country, has a sponsoring group in Canada, they're not able to return to their home country, and they can't stay in their current country. And also, they don't have any offers to be resettled in a different safe country. Okay, so on the next slide, we will look at who can be included in an application. So when you sponsor a refugee, who can be included? And this slide shows what the Canadian government considers to be a family. So that means all the family members fall within this, that fall within the definition can be on one application together. So there's the principal refugee applicant, and this is the person who meets the definition of a refugee. And in the case of a group of 5 or a community sponsor, they have a refugee status document. And then their spouse or their common law partner can be included, as well as all of their dependent children who are under 22 years old and are unmarried. So again, if you are sponsoring one person who is a refugee, they are able to bring along their spouse or their common law partner and all of their children who are unmarried and under 22 years old. Okay, we'll talk now about what it costs to sponsor someone, because this is a very frequent question we get is, how much is it going to cost? The sponsorship costs include things like the cost of food, rent and household utilities, and other day-to-day living expenses. It also includes clothing, furniture, and other household goods. And there are 3 ways to demonstrate that you have the funds in order to cover this cost when you apply to sponsor someone. So The funds can be held in a trust account at a financial institution, or group members can contribute from their own personal income in order to sponsor the refugee. Or the third option is a combination of those. Some of the funds can be held in a trust account, and the rest of the funds could be contributed from the personal income of the group members. Okay, and we'll look now at some of the actual costs. This is called the sponsorship cost table, and it shows an estimate across the country of how much it will cost to sponsor refugees. And as you'll see on this table, basically the estimated cost to bring one refugee is $16,500. So that's a combination of 12 months of income support and the startup costs that they receive. So as the family gets bigger, of course, the cost goes up. So if you look down to say, if you're sponsoring a family of 4, the cost is $28,700. And so you can find this sponsorship cost table on the government website again, or on our website, and you can use it as a reference to see how much money you will need to have in order to sponsor a group of refugees. There is a way to make the cost of sponsorship a little less expensive, and that is through in-kind donations. So IRCC will recognize donations as part of the sponsorship if you have things like clothing or furniture or household needs. You can donate them to the refugee. And when you donate these things, you can subtract that amount of money from the total cost of the sponsorship. So you can see here that if you donate furniture and you have one refugee coming, you can subtract $1,085 from the cost of the sponsorship. And of course, the most expensive part of the cost is shelter. That's essentially rent for their first year. So if you have somewhere for the refugees to stay, even if it's just one refugee, you could subtract as much as $7,000 from the cost of sponsorship. So when you're sponsoring refugees, this is a table that you can use to see how much money you could subtract from the cost if you have specific things that you can donate to them. Okay, I'll talk now about settlement and what the obligations are of sponsors when a refugee arrives in Canada. So these are some of the settlement tasks that the sponsors have to fulfill. Welcoming the refugees at the airport when they arrive. Applying for health cards and other documents. Helping the newcomers to find housing. Enrolling them in English classes if they don't speak English. Helping to connect them with a local settlement agency where they live. And helping them to find a doctor, dentist, or be connected to other health services. So in addition, as I said, to covering the cost of the sponsorship, the sponsors are also obligated to provide these settlement supports to the refugees when they arrive in Canada. And one of the really important obligations is to try to connect the newcomers with a settlement agency like MCAF if they're in the Fredericton area, where they can get further help in their settlement. And when you fill out your application to sponsor a refugee, the government is going to look very closely at whether you're able to provide all of these settlement supports. So it's very important when you apply that you show them that you're able to help the newcomers to do all of these things when they arrive in Canada. Okay, so here is our website. It's rstp.ca. And this is an excellent resource if you're interested in sponsoring refugees. Our website usually has the answers to most questions that people have about private refugee sponsorship. You'll also find on the RSTP website the application forms, any updates and resources, as well as many videos about private refugee sponsorship. Also, each month we have a 6-part webinar series that goes into a lot more detail about sponsoring refugees. And so if you are interested in sponsoring someone, I definitely recommend taking part in our webinar series that runs each month. We also offer an e-training course so that you can take a training course on sponsoring refugees. And everything is offered in both English and French. Okay, so again, that is our website. And that really concludes the all of the things I wanted to present to you today. And I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have for me about private refugee sponsorship. And I'm just going to leave my contact information on the screen in case anyone wants to get in contact with me about private sponsorship as well. So are there any questions? You can feel free to type them in the chat or you can raise your hand. So I see Abdullahi, you have your hand raised. Are you able to just unmute yourself and ask your question?
Just a second, I will give Abdullahi access to turn on his microphone. Just
Yeah,
a
great.
second. Yeah, Abdullahi, I think you can speak.
You may just have to unmute yourself and then we could hear you.
Oh, or if the access doesn't work, could you please just type it in the chat box? I'm sorry.
Okay, so while we're waiting for Abdullahi, I see another question from Yelzal, who asked in the chat if someone gets married in another country, can they bring their spouse to Canada? So if you're doing a refugee sponsorship and you get married, you can, yes, bring your spouse to Canada, as long as you qualify under the definitions of what a refugee is and you meet all of the other requirements, you're able to bring your spouse. And another question about how many months it takes to process. Yeah, so it can be a fairly long process. Normally, it takes about maybe 9 to 10 months before IRCC starts looking through your application. So you'll receive a confirmation from them that they're considering your application. And the first part of the application takes part in Canada, where the government in Ottawa looks at your application. And that could take as much as a year. And if it's approved, then it's sent overseas to the country where the refugee lives. And it could take another 10 months to a year and a half, where it will be considered in the country where the refugee lives. And they will go through an interview process and a security check and all of those things in the country where they are. So altogether, it can easily take more than 2 years, but it just depends on how backed up the government is and how many applicants there are in the country where the refugee lives. So I hope that answers your question. So Abdullahi is asking about being able to sponsor his mother. It's the same process, even if it's someone in your family. The first thing you would do would be to go either to the government website or our website to get the application forms, and you would fill out the application forms. And then the person who you want to sponsor has to also fill out an application form, and then you would send them all together to the government. And for anyone who needs help in this process, you can always reach out to me. This is what I do. I help people with their sponsorships, and I'd be happy to help you. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I see Abdullahi is typing now, so give him a few more minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so someone's asking about if they're not a refugee. So this program, again, is only for refugees. If someone is a refugee, but they don't have a refugee status document, then you need to reach out to a sponsorship agreement holder. And we have some here in New Brunswick. They're able to sponsor people who don't have a refugee status document. But if they are not a refugee at all, then unfortunately they wouldn't qualify for this program. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so Kara is asking, how does someone become a refugee? So the first requirement of being a refugee is that you have left your country of origin, and the reason that you left was due to either persecution because of your political beliefs or group that you belong to, or because you're fleeing armed conflict, you're fleeing war that's happening in your country. And so if you have left your country for one of those reasons and you're living in a second country, then you can qualify as a refugee. And then during the application process, the government is going to look into all of those things to determine whether they think you meet the definition of a refugee. And then some refugees are able to get a refugee status document, which is further proof that allows them to be sponsored by a group of 5. I see that Kara is just writing a follow-up, or maybe not. I hope that answers the question. Any other questions? Oh, I see. Kara's asking about, is there a UN office in every country, and is there any way to check this? There is on the, let me see, on the UN website, they would have a list of, they're called visa offices. And the Canadian government website also has a list of their visa offices in different countries. And so you would have to check on their website what countries they exist in. But certainly every country that I'm aware of has some kind of UN presence. And refugees can also seek refugee status with the government of the country that they're in as well. And so if they're not able to find a UN office, they can always approach the federal government and ask for refugee status from them.
Hi, Lucy. I have already gave you the access, so turn on your microphone and and you can ask your question.
I think Lucy put her question in the chat.
Oh, I see it now. Okay, thank you. If someone wants to get married in their home country, can they go ahead and get married or report it to IRCC? So maybe you're asking, like, if someone who is being sponsored gets married, are they able to continue, or do they need to report it to IRCC? So yeah, if someone gets married, let's say if it's during the application process, they're already have already filed an application to be sponsored, they would need to report that to IRCC so that their spouse can be added to their application. Yes. If they're married before the application process starts, then they just add their spouse when they fill out the application. But if the application process has already started and they get married, that's fine. You would just contact IRCC and notify them about the new spouse, and then they could be added to the application. Okay, looks like someone else is maybe typing in the chat. You're welcome. Okay, Kara's asking, what if someone is already here in Canada, accepted as PR, and they want to get married and bring their spouse? Would they only be able to marry an official refugee? And the PA here in Canada would have to travel to another country to marry them. Yeah, so in order for the spouse to qualify for this program, they would have to be a refugee. That's right, if they're outside their country of origin. Now, there is a different immigration path for permanent residents who have family members outside of Canada called, it's basically the family class of sponsorship. And so I would check if they're not a refugee, they could possibly be brought in under the family class if they have someone in Canada who's a permanent resident. But if you are already in Canada and then you married someone from a different country, just clarify they are not married when they arrive in Canada, but they may be engaged. Yeah, so if they're only engaged when they come to Canada, then they wouldn't be able to bring their fiance with them, because in order to be considered part of the family, they'd have to be either a spouse or a common law partner. If they marry someone when they're already in Canada, if that person is a refugee, they could certainly be sponsored. And if they're not, I would look into the family class sponsorship, which allows permanent residents here to bring family members from other countries. I hope that answers your question, Kara. Okay, any further questions? Again, if you have a specific situation that you need help with or that you are interested in bringing people over, feel free to reach out to me and I can always help you individually with whatever your circumstances are.
Okay, I think we don't see any new question come to chat box. So I guess that will be all for today. Thank you, team,
Okay.
for your great presentation.
Sure.
If our clients have any further questions or need additional information, so we will connect with you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Jean, can I stop you for a moment? Kara is trying to ask a question. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Thank you,
Sorry.
Sheila. Yeah, I see from the chat box, Kara has a new question.
Yeah, so she's asking if someone can apply to privately sponsor someone if they're on some kind of financial assistance, such as social assistance. Yes, it is possible. Now, normally, if you are applying to sponsor someone, you would have to be part of a group of 5 people or more, or be doing it through a sponsorship agreement holder. And so either way, you have to demonstrate to the government that you have the financial means to be able to sponsor, to cover the cost of the sponsorship. So being on social assistance wouldn't necessarily mean that it's impossible, but you do have to show them that you have enough money either in a trust account or that you have multiple people who pledge money from their income in order to cover the cost of the sponsorship. So you aren't automatically disqualified if you're on social assistance, but you are going to have to demonstrate to the government that you have the means to cover the costs of the sponsorship. Okay, thank you for that question, Kara. Okay, if there's no other questions, yeah, thank you to everyone for coming and for joining us. And again, feel free to reach out if you want to contact me personally with any other questions.
Yes, thank you, team, again. And I should say thank you, teachers and our interpreters for facilitating today's presentation. Okay, now it's off before today. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.